Hey Troy, so glad you're joining us here today.
Hi, how are you? It's really exciting to be here.
So tell us a little about yourself and then let's get rocking and rolling.
Sure. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I live in Arizona. I have a private practice here. I am a two-time Amazon bestselling author, a workbook called Finding Peace, which is really kind of about attachment wounds. We're going to talk a little bit more about that today. Um, and I just had another book that was published in November called A Year of Self-Love, which is 365 different entries every day to remind ourselves to practice self-compassion, which I think we all need to be able to do, especially right now when there's a lot of stress and a lot of uncertainty going on. Being able to be kind to ourselves helps us be kind to others. So I love the research behind self-compassion, and I'm a fan. So that's a little bit about me. I have 15 years of experience treating sex addiction and also working with couples, working through um, the difficulties of being married to someone who struggles with sex addiction. And I have a specialty in EMDR and other trauma specialties as well. So that's a little bit about me.
And you also gratefully moderate a group on Friday mornings for the guys. So
Yes,
he's a double player on our website.
yes, that's a fun group. I really enjoy that. So it's great.
So do you have a topic today that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, one of the things that came up in the group that I have with the guys was there were some challenges that some of them were having in their relationships with others, and so I taught them a little piece that I thought, well, this would probably be good for everybody. It can be recorded. I filled in for Matt um, a couple of weeks ago and taught this a little bit. So this will be a little bit of a repeat for them, but I wanted to be able to just provide some more, open it up for questions afterwards as well. But I think it's an important piece. It helps describe what's usually happening when conflict shows up in relationships and how that's tied to what I call attachment wounds and what we can do about that. So if that's okay, I would
Please.
like to do that. Okay, so let me share my screen. There we go.
While you're doing that, someone commented that they're working on your book and online program, Finding Peace with that today and the last couple of days, going well. So that's nice.
Oh, nice. That's awesome. Thank you. I I hope that they find that really enjoyable, and helpful. All right, here we go. So, can you see that?
Yes.
All right. So it's the death loop of relationships. This is what happens with conflict. It is grounded in Sue Johnson's emotionally focused couples therapy work. Um, so I've used her work as part of this, and then putting some of my own vocabulary in there to help make sense for me when I'm trying to teach this to other people and how it works. So if you can think about the conflict that you've had, it could be with a loved one, it could be with one of your children, it could be with somebody at work. This can happen in any kind of relationship that you have, but we're going to be looking specifically at as we're talking through this in an intimate relationship, but you can put any relationship into this and you will probably see the same effect. So if you can think about the last time that maybe you had a conflict with somebody, and just kind of walk yourself through this as we're going along and see how you can fit how it fits or doesn't fit for you, and then we can open it up to questions as well. So let's see. There we go. Okay. So It starts out with something happens that bumps up against one of your attachment wounds. It triggers one of your attachment wounds. And those wounds are loss, neglect, rejection, abandonment, betrayal, and abuse. And we've talked a little bit about that in previous webinars about what those are. And so if you want to go back and watch one of those, feel free to do so. They're also explained a little bit more detail in the Finding Peace workbook as well, but those are the 6 attachment wounds. And the premise is that as humans, we're wired for connection. We're wired physically, emotionally, spiritually, neurologically. We're wired to be connected to one another. And if something happens that damages one of those connections, it can cause a wound. And then we call it, I name the wounds what they are, the 6 types of wounds, to help me have a better idea of what kind of wound care might be necessary for each one of those wounds, because wound care is going to look different depending on the type of wound. But if you think about the interaction that you had, with the conflict that you had, see if you can identify what wound got triggered for you. Were you feeling a rejection? Were you feeling abandoned? Were you feeling betrayed? Were you feeling a loss? Were you feeling abused? What was that wound that got activated for you and bumped up against? And I tell people, when we're in a relationship with someone else, I entered into the relationship with my own wounds. And usually when we start to fall in love with someone, it's almost like there's this anesthesia that runs through our body and we don't feel those wounds. It doesn't hurt. And we think that everything's going to be lollipops and rainbows and stuff. But after we've been with the person for a little while, that anesthesia starts to wear off and they start to bump up against my wounds and I bump up against theirs too. So we both entered into this relationship with wounds. And I think sometimes, especially when we're young, like young 20s, we don't even recognize what wounds they are, but we start bumping up against them. The fact that we live together, sleep together, eat together, we're going to bump up against each other's wounds. That's part of the process. But so these wounds get triggered. And then what happens is that, excuse me, there is a negative core belief that has been wired into our nervous system as a result of those wounds. And so this comes from the new work that has really just started to come out in the last couple of years called the polyvagal theory. And so if you're familiar with any of that, that's that the trauma is very much connected to our nervous system. So when the wound gets hit, it activates our nervous system and we either go into fight or flight response or we go into shutdown mode, depending on the severity of the wound and the pain. But in that, we have some negative core beliefs that have been wired into our nervous system that also get activated. So the moment that the wound gets hit, that negative core belief also gets activated. And there's 3 genres of negative core beliefs. And it could be that all 3 get activated. It could be just one of them gets activated or 2. But those negative core beliefs have been wired into our nervous system. So the moment that the wound gets hit, bam, that it like rockets through our body. So the 3 genres are I am, and usually when it's a negative core belief, it's I'm not enough, there's something wrong with me, I'm bad, I'm unworthy, I'm too much of this, I'm not enough of that. It's the sense of my identity, and it's that, and then I'm flawed and defective. The second genre is about safety or trust. I can't depend on other people to be there. My world doesn't feel safe. No one's going to show up for me. I'm all alone. That kind of genre. And the third is a sense of powerlessness. The message is there's nothing I can do. I can't do anything about that. So if we just even think what we were talking about right at the beginning with what's going on with the coronavirus, that can activate these wounds, this wound of loss or this wound of neglect or whatever, and then the sense of, well, there's nothing I can do, like I'm powerless, that can really play a role in our feeling distressed. So then what happens is that Oh, this is all happening probably within a nanosecond. So this is happening very, very electrically, very quickly. Once those negative core beliefs have been activated, it's going to then trigger our brain to start releasing uh, chemicals that are going to cause us to feel some feelings. And there's three core emotions that we take a look at in particular. I'm either going to start feeling angry, or I'm going to start feeling afraid, or I'm going to start feeling sad. We can feel other emotions too, but those are the core emotions. What's happening? This wound just got triggered. My rejection wound just got triggered. I'm feeling like I'm not enough, and now I'm really afraid that you're not going to show up for me, or I'm really sad because I just feel like I'm powerless. There's nothing I can do, or I'm really angry. Like you just triggered my betrayal wound. You just triggered my rejection wound. I'm pissed about that. So it could be any of those emotions. It could be all three. But we live in a world where being able to express those core emotions is really hard. And we have kind of a shame-based culture around being able to express our emotions. And so if I have these negative core beliefs that say that I'm not enough, there's something wrong with me, I can't trust you, and I'm powerless, but I'm really mad and I'm really sad, well, I don't know what to do with that. I got to figure out how to shut that down. I can't share that with you. You'll probably judge me if I share what's going on, or you're going to react in some way. So I'm just going to not share it, or I'm going to explode on you. But underneath that is a sense of shame. Like I can't actually be real. I can't be real about what's going on with me. So that if this process continues and I don't have a way to actually express what's going on with me, I'm going to go into shame. And then what's going to happen is I'm going to go into numbing or protective behaviors, because this is very, very painful. I'm going to go into a behavior to try and protect myself, a defense mechanism, or I'm going to go into a numbing behavior. I came up with the acronym burpees. If you have done burpees in real life, I hate them. I
I
hate
do
burpees.
too, but
I hate them. So I thought, what can I use to remember this for me? And so here's the acronym BRPE, burpee. These are some of the numbing or protective behaviors that we can engage in. We can go into blame. We can start to point fingers at the other person, say this is all your fault. We can try to focus on how the other person is wrong, and try to deflect my pain and what I'm feeling onto you, and it's all your fault. So we can go into blame. I can also go into rescue mode. I can try and make you feel better. I'm not going to own what's going on with me, but I'm going to try and solve your problems, or I'm going to try and rescue you, or try to minimize your discomfort. I can also go into protest mode, which is victim-y, like, why is this happening to me? This is nothing ever seems to get any better. Like, it's always going to be like that. So we can go into protest mode, or I can just go into escape. I can just check out. I can um, go leave. I can pull up my phone and zone out there. I can find a way to check out. But all of those are numbing or protective behaviors. And then what happens with that is that the moment that I do that, chances are I'm now going to bump up against my partner's attachment wound. I've just activated their attachment wound. So if I go into blame, I might activate their rejection wound. If I go into escape, I might activate their neglect wound. If I go into protesting, I'm I might I'm pulling away from them, that might end up activating their abandonment or their neglect wound. So in my process of trying to numb my pain, I inevitably bump up against one of their wounds, and then they will go through the same cycle. It will activate one of their negative core beliefs, and then it will activate their core emotions, anger, fear, or sadness. And then if they don't have the tools to be able to deal with that, they're going to go into shame as well. And then they're going to engage in numbing and protective behaviors. And as they engage in numbing and protective behaviors, well, that just reopens one of my wounds or the same one. And then you'll notice this is like an infinity loop. This just goes around and around and around unless we figure out how to stop it. So I'll pause there for a second and see if any questions or discussion about any of that.
I don't see any questions. So for those of you joining us, feel free in the Q&A at the bottom to add any questions about this. This is such a helpful visual though, Troy, to I often have calls and emails from people, the partners, and the addicts, and like I see and then he does this, and then she does this, and so when you're showing the visual of the infinity loop, I was like, yes, that's exactly what it feels like, and until someone can step out of that, this pattern probably almost has to repeat itself because there's not coping skills to do it differently. When we talk about with addiction, whatever form of addiction it is, it's a symptom, because ultimately we're looking for the escape, we're looking for the numbing, we're looking to be zoned out. So so this is very helpful.
Good. Yeah, thank you. I'm glad. I found that helpful as well. So I shared this with couples, and then they can recognize it. And I often say, okay, I want you to give this a name. Give this cycle a name, so that when you guys start to get into it, Sue Johnson encourages that as well. Give this cycle a name so that you can say, hey, we're in that cycle again, kind of as a heads up of, hey, we're doing that thing that we hate doing and it's not going to end well, so let's give it a name. That's helpful to just give it a name so we can do something about it. But what I've also found is that, okay, I've given it a name and I'm there, but I don't know how in the heck to get out of the cycle. And even as I was working with couples at the beginning and learning more about the EFT start, I'm like, okay, you're in the cycle, and they're like, yes, I know I'm in the cycle, but I don't know how to get out. What in the heck do I do? So I want to be able to show a little bit of how we get out of that as well. But it's important to understand that we can get in this cycle really easily, and to just start to recognize, oh, yep, we're in that cycle. One of the ways to be able to do that is to identify that there's two parts to this. Like, there's one half of the cycle and then there's the other half of the cycle. The only part that I have any control or power over is my half of the infinity loop. So that's important to understand. Like, I can't own or do anything about the other person's side of the cycle. I can only take a look at my side of the cycle, and I can start to look at what's going on with me. And if I'm clear about that, that's going to help me take some different steps to be able to get out of the cycle. If all I do is continue to expect the other person to get out of the infinity loop, that is not going to work out. So I got to take a look at me. So part of that is recognizing, oh, we're in the cycle. What attachment wound is getting triggered for me? Which one is it for me? And is it the loss? Is it the rejection? Is it the betrayal? And I often caution people when we do this to not use the two letters ED at the end of the word when you start to talk to your partner. So for example, I'm feeling rejected or abandoned or betrayed, because that has a connotation of blame.
Mm.
You are rejecting me, you are betraying me, and if I go into blame, that's probably going to activate their wound, and we're going to stay in the cycle. So instead, being able to own that this is my wound, and I brought this wound probably from most of us brought these wounds into our relationships. We had them well before we met the person. I get betrayal does show up. Can be a new wound that is created in a relationship when you find out that your partner maybe was struggling with a sex addiction and you didn't know that. That could be a betrayal wound that opened up and was new in the relationship. Any of these can be new in a relationship, so I don't want to minimize that. A lot of the time, though, we've brought these into the relationship already. So I use words like, my rejection wound just got triggered. My betrayal wound is really tender right now. So There's not, you did it to me. It's like, this is my wound. And it got bumped. You may have bumped up against it, like you bumped up against it, but I've had this wound for a while and it hurts. And I've found that if I'm able to do that, if the other person can see that pain and they can have some empathy for that, that's going to help us get out of the cycle a little bit better. But if I go into, you betrayed me, you rejected me, you hurt me, we immediately go into that sense of blame, and that's not going to help very much. Any thoughts about that?
Oh, I love that, because yeah, I can, well, first of all, if I'm blaming you, I'm also feeling like a victim of things. And it feels a lot more empowering, even to me, if I say, I'm, my betrayal is, wound is feeling vulnerable right now, or feeling tender, like you said, that is like, it's a recognition of information, but it isn't blaming or victimizing either person. It's just like, oh, this is where I'm at in the moment. I'm
Yeah.
telling you about it, and now we've got information so that we don't have to do the infinity loop if we don't want to.
Yeah. I love, like little kids love to show you their owies. They
Yeah.
love to show you their scars, like, you want to see my scab, that kind of thing. And it's kind of that same mentality of like, oh, can I show you my wound? It hurts. It really stings. You bumped up against it, but I want to show it to you. And being able to do that in a place. So
And that feels like it takes some courage to be willing to be vulnerable. Like it's really so much more familiar to do this pattern, even if it's not working. But
right.
for me to be brave enough to go, Troy, I'm here's where I'm really at. You bumped up against this, but it's me, and I'm showing you the real me. I have to be willing to be vulnerable.
Yeah, the other day, I was struggling, and I had reached out to a couple of my friends to say, hey, I'm not doing well. And their response, it was all through text, so that was problem number one. uh, they couldn't hear my distress in my voice, and the response that they gave back was kind of, I felt flippant to me, and it almost felt like you weren't taking this seriously. There was like a little smiley face in there, and that automatically that triggered my rejection wound. And I wanted to go right into the numbing behavior and pull away and like just stop talking to him. I was like, I'm gonna not talk to you anymore for a while, kind of
You're
punish you,
not safe. I
right?
can't do it. Yes. Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, totally going into escape. But I like, no, no, I know where that's gonna go. It's just gonna keep me in the cycle. So I called him and said, I got to tell you, like that bumped up against my rejection. And he's like, how did that? I don't understand. I thought I was trying to show up for you. And I'm like, okay, well, and I was able to do it without saying you did it, but I was able to say, this is my wound. And he was gracious enough to be able to listen. He's like, well, dude, that's totally not my intent. And I said, looking at it, I can see how you didn't hear my distress because this was all via text. So that didn't work out that well. But I was able to step into that, and he was able to hold space. But you're right, it does take courage. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to just like shut down, and so I get, yeah.
And hold the resentment because he's wounded you. So.
Yes, right.
Mhm.
So have to remember, like, don't put the ed at the end of these words because he didn't do that. So it's interesting that. Okay, so this is how we shift out then. Okay. So I'm going to start in the middle, actually, which is how we get out of this. So it's a two-part steps. It's two steps to be able to do this. And then one is empathy, and the other is ownership. Empathy comes first most of the time, and then ownership. And so I'll explain that a little bit. Nick Tak Han, man, I can never see that guy's name right. He's a Buddhist monk, really cool dude. He gave an interview with Oprah, and he talked about the four mantras of a relationship, and I just love it. And I don't have the link in front of me, but um, the four mantras, see if I can remember them. Um, darling, I, darling, I see you. Darling, I'm there. Darling, I suffer. Darling, I know that you suffer. Those are the four mantras. And he does a much better job of explaining those. So you can just go Google him and Oprah, and you'll be able to find the link. Um, and these are the mantras that he encourages couples to do in a relationship. So, darling, I see you. Darling, I see you. Like, I know that you're there. So I decided to pull that off in one of my couple sessions where I had the couple look at each other, just look at each other in the eye, and they used the third mantra, which is, darling, I suffer. And can I share with you a little bit about my attachment wound? And so the husband shared a little bit about his attachment wound, and then the wife shared a little bit about her attachment wound. And it's, darling, I suffer. And then the fourth mantra is, darling, I can see that you're suffering, and I'm here for you. And the amazing thing that happened in that session was that the wife, who has a lot of pain, says, I can't look at your wounds. Like, I can't look at it. It's too overwhelming for me. I'm not willing to look at your pain at all. I am so consumed with my own pain. I cannot look at your pain at all. And that was like a light bulb moment for me, because what she was really saying is, I don't have the capacity to have empathy for you right now, which explained why we were so stuck in the couples counseling, because her wounds were so painful and so overwhelming for her that she didn't have the ability to hold space for his wounds. And if we're going to get out of this cycle, we have to be able to be in a place where we can do that, or to own that I'm not in a place where I can do that. And so that we can step out of the cycle and just kind of regroup for a little while. But in order to get out of this, I have to be able to see your wounds and have compassion for your wounds. That's the empathy piece. I have my own wounds, and they hurt and they're painful, and I want you to see them, but I also have to recognize that you're hurting too, and that your wounds are just as painful as mine, and have some compassion for your wounds and a desire to not want to keep bumping up against them. So that's the first piece of how do we get out of that. Any questions or thoughts about that?
Oh, I think it's really interesting. And I actually want to know, when you talk about pulling away. So if someone is unable to hold the space and have the empathy, and you talk about, stepping away, I'm assuming you mean, and then they're going to do some supportive work on, their wounds, so that they can hopefully re-engage in a different way. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Like taking a timeout, like,
Yeah.
and not indefinitely. So you can say, hey, I need a timeout, 10 minutes, 60 minutes. But the agreement is, we are going to come back and revisit this at some point. A lot of times some couples get really frustrated is they take a timeout, and then the one partner tries to pretend that that never happened and just like
Mm,
move on, like, that never happened, we're good now, right? We're good.
yeah.
No, we're not good. We need to go back and talk about what the wounds were that got triggered for each other, and so we can help each other. So there does need to be an agreement to be willing to come back and have the tough conversation. We can't just go to escape and then pretend that this never happened, because that doesn't work very well.
I think it'd be really easy to go to a place too where it's, well, let me tell you about my wounds, where, my wounds are bigger than your wounds. And so to not have empathy for the other person, because, because I still feel like, my wounds are way bigger than yours. So you minimize yours, dismiss yours, even though it's very real and very painful for you. It feels like that would be another spot. We've got thoughts on that?
Well, that's the hard part. And you think about, like, if you are physically injured, if you got hurt and you're laid up for a while, of course, the emphasis is going to be on your pain. You're in the hospital, whatever, and you're uh, you're needing morphine or whatever to help deal with some of the pain. You just had surgery, knee surgery or whatever. Of course, there is like the pain is acute. The pain is right there. It in that moment, I understand how hard it is to want to be empathic and realize that the other person is suffering too. So that's kind of where we use the self-compassion and recognize that I am suffering. I do suffer. It's okay to acknowledge that I'm suffering. The key part with self-compassion is we have to add two more elements. The common humanity. I'm not the only one who's suffering. I know that I'm not alone in my suffering. There are other people in this world who are also suffering just like me. And recognizing that I'm not alone in my suffering helps. And then what can I do to be kind to myself in this place of suffering? Those are some things I can do on my part that doesn't really have anything to do with my partner to help me get grounded a little bit. Uh, Forgot her name. She has a website, self-compassion.org, and she has the self-compassion moment, Christian Neff. And that's a very, the 5-minute compassion moment. You can do it. And just like I'm suffering, it hurts. I'm not alone in my suffering. Let me be kind to myself. So that helps us maybe get out of that. But the reality is that in a relationship, both of us are wounded. If you're the partner of someone who's struggling with a sex addiction, yes, your betrayal wound is really painful. It hurts. I get it. At the same time, your husband or your wife or your partner has wounds probably since childhood that they have used sex addiction as a way of numbing those wounds, and those wounds run deep for that person too. And so it it's unfortunate that they haven't found healthier ways to deal with those wounds, and in their secrecy and in their denial and in their lies, that activates your betrayal wound, and that's that cycle we get into. But recognizing that they are wounded too, and they don't have the tools and the skills to be able to work to know how to heal these wounds either, so they've been using tools that just drive us to feel more shame, that don't work, but that's what they know. And so recognizing you're hurting and I'm hurting, we're both hurting, and recognizing that may my pain is big, but it may not be any bigger than yours. It may be different. But when we compare our pain to somebody else's pain, that's kind of less effective. How do you measure how much pain you're in versus someone else? The reality is I'm in pain and you're in pain, and it hurts for both of us.
So we have a couple questions. So I want to tie these in before you go on. This person shares, I love the idea of showing my owie, but my sex addict husband is in early recovery, so I don't really feel safe doing that at this point since he is just starting to develop empathy. Can you talk a little bit about timing?
Yeah, so I love that question. When we're up to our eyeballs in our sex addiction, our capacity for empathy is like like really, really teeny. So I want to validate that that's a legitimate concern, and that goes into the ownership part, which I haven't talked about yet. But recognizing, okay, I still have these pains, so who can I reach out to in a healthy way and be able to process some of my wounds of betrayal and work through some of that. And we're going to talk about the needs in a minute to answer that. But I want to validate that, yeah, early on in recovery, addicts really don't have a great ability to be able to be empathic because they've been in so much pain. They've been so wrapped up in their own pain that they don't know how to be able to step through and show up for you and recognize that your pain is just as painful as well. So we try to teach them how to do that in the course of recovery, and we try to help them not be so defensive in that process, how to mirror and paraphrase. But so I want to validate that what you're saying is I don't feel safe enough yet to be vulnerable. So then the question is, okay, what do you need in order to feel safer so that you can begin to open up a little bit with him? And we'll talk more about that in just a second, but that's the question of I don't feel safe. Let me validate that I don't feel safe. So what do I need to help me feel safer?
Okay. And then the next one, I've been married 35 years to my husband, who is a sex porn addict discovered 3 years ago. I'm struggling with deep trauma bonding. The descriptive cycle you show is going on in most of our conversations when I ask him questions regarding anything with his recovery and addiction. My trauma wounds are abandonment and betrayal, and my husband triggers them when he shifts to blame, defend, anger, and rage, and then he shuts down. Then it's always me who is the one who reaches out to talk it out. Even though I am the one who is hurt by him, I start to panic and feel abandoned. How do I hold safe space for myself, not abandon myself, yet keep communication open? They've been together since age 17, so long
Thank,
time.
yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Thanks for being vulnerable with us. So you did a really great job of being able to identify your trauma wounds are abandonment and betrayal. What are your husband's trauma wounds? And I'm guessing that one of his big ones is rejection, just based on what you're saying. I don't know him from Adam, but I'm guessing that that's one of his. And there's definitely a bond that addicts have with shame. I just was reading a quote from Jay Stringer in his book Unwanted about how acting out is we're not actually acting out to seek pleasure. That's what we think we're doing, but what we're really acting out is to reinforce that I am a horrible person, to reinforce the shame. So if I already have a rejection wound, uh, and I'm feeling a lot of shame around that, and then my partner starts to ask me about, hey, like my spidey senses are coming up, something's not right, are you acting out? Immediately, that activates my shame. Again, that's not your fault. That's totally not your fault. You have a legitimate question. Your body sensors are showing up. That's legitimate, but that's bumping up against his wound. And if he doesn't know how to work through all of that, he's immediately going to go into those numbing and protective behaviors and become defensive and blame and point fingers. But what's underneath that is his rejection wound is really raw, and his negative core beliefs are I'm flawed, I'm defective, I can't actually tell you what's really going on. You're going to push me away. None of that's probably true. Those are the negative core beliefs that he has wired that probably he's carried with him since childhood of if I was real, if I actually shared what I was feeling, somebody shut me down, told me I was not enough. And so that's probably what's going on. So then he goes into the defend, anger, and rage, and then shuts down. He goes in that escape mode, which then leaves you feeling more betrayed, more neglected, and that perpetuates the cycle like you identified. So your question was, how do I hold space for myself and not abandon myself, yet be open to communication? And that goes right into those needs. So what do you need in order to feel safe? What do you need to be able to yourself? Do you need to be able to turn to some supportive other women who can also hold space for you and be able to talk about the distress that happens when this cycle happens? Do you need to be able to practice some self-compassion and say, look, I know that this is, it may also help to say, look, I'm guessing you're really afraid that if you're open and honest with me, I'm going to judge you. And I probably have engaged in some of those behaviors in the past where, because I'm scared, it's activating my wounds. And so you're probably afraid that I'm going to react in a way that's going to push you away. And I want to be able to own that I have done that. And that's where the ownership piece comes in. But I want to work on being able to hold space for you and your woundedness too, so that we can heal together because we're both suffering here.
That's really helpful. And then there's one more. In comparing wounds in relationships, I tell my husband that when he looked at porn, he ignored me and I felt myself fill my needs. He tells me he feels rejected and gets hurt because I stopped paying attention to him. This to me is equivalent of someone who physically hits their spouse, then complaining to the spouse that that his hand hurts. Sometimes the spouse doesn't have the ability or empathy to hold their abuser's attachment wounds.
So thank you for that. What I'm hearing is that both of you are having these wounds. So you've identified that your rejection wound is being activated, and that you've found some healthy ways to deal with that, but your rejection wound is being activated. And then if you and he has a rejection wound as well. So what I've found to be the case is when we map this out with couples, often my wound is the same as your wound. My rejection wound is your rejection wound. Like, we have the same wound. We're coping with it, but it's actually the same wound, which if I can identify, oh, it's the same wound, well, I know what rejection feels like for me. It sucks. It's horrible. It's painful. Is that what it feels like for you too? Well, yeah. Whoa. Well, if I can step into that place, um, I can have empathy for, well, I know how much it hurts to feel rejected, and I don't want to feel that, and I don't want you to feel that either. If I can validate that that must be really hard for you, and you can validate that must be really hard for me, we're going to a deeper connection. We're actually going to get our needs met, and we're not going to stay in this cycle. But if I stay in the place, well, you hurt me, I'm now in protest. That's the protest out of the burpees. That's the protest mode. Well, you hurt me. We're going to stay in there, because the more that I do that, I protest and blame, and the other person is going to feel rejected, and then they're going to do what they know how to do, which is usually escape or blame themselves, and we just stay in. So that's why empathy is really a key, and shame is the opposite of empathy. Empathy is the antidote to shame. Brene Brown talks a lot about that's what helps decrease shame. But empathy is a crucial part of how we're going to heal in this relationship, to recognize that you have wounds that are really painful, and so do I. How can we help each other heal those wounds rather than just get really pissed off that you keep bumping up against my wounds?
She adds, yes, but the problem is he won't acknowledge my wounds. He wants me to soothe his wounds. There's only so much empathy that I can hold before I feel like I'm being taken advantage of.
Yeah.
And, and you've shared before, there are people that are on a recovery path, and then there are people that are not. And unfortunately, there are people that choose not to do anything to make things different.
In EFT work, there's usually a withdrawer and there's a pursuer. And the withdrawer is the one who's like pulling away and won't acknowledge their feelings and put their walls up and all that stuff. And then there's the pursuer who's like, wait, come here, I need you to come. Pursuing often looks like blame. It often looks like there's some blame, but they're really trying to reach out and engage. And then the person who's pulling away. So when we're working with a couple like that, we actually try to help the person who's the pursuer, like, hold it for a minute. The person who's withdrawing doesn't feel safe enough to actually demonstrate empathy. There's so much rejection or abandonment going on that they don't feel safe. So I don't know your particular situation, but what I'm hearing as I'm reading into it is that he's got so much pain going on that he's actually not able to hold space for you and have empathy for you. And it's so hard for him to even acknowledge that you have wounds, because I would imagine there's a negative core belief that says, I'm bad. It's my fault. I'm a horrible person. So if I acknowledge that you're hurting, it seems like I'm also acknowledging how bad of a horrible person is, and I go into that shame place, which doesn't help. So hopefully what he can be able to do is work on some of those negative core beliefs for him, and work through some of those shame stories that are going on for him, and recognize that, um, yeah, he has engaged in behaviors that are hurtful, but he's actually not a horrible person, and that he can, if he can step into, I'm actually trying to hold space and show that I do care, I can then step out of that shame a little bit and hold space for you. I don't know how long that's going to take. I don't know how much recovery work he's done. He may not ever be able to do that, and then that's where the ownership part comes in for you, of saying, well, I don't know what I'm going to have to do in this, because I do need to be able to make sure that I also feel safe.
Hang on, that was okay. So then another and this is a really helpful comment. A great way to hold space for yourself is to tell yourself, what would you tell your best friend? Sometimes we forget how to be kind to ourselves. And I thought that is great. I mean, because I would tell my friends something sometimes different than, than I would be harsher with myself, so
Hmm.
I like that. Then there's another question. It's in the comment section, but so thoughts on that?
Yeah. So if he to recognize the first part of your sentence is that he's in early recovery, so he doesn't have empathy down yet. It's kind of like expecting a first grader to sit down and play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony when they've only been taking piano lessons for 3 weeks. um, that expectation of I need you to show up and have empathy for me is unrealistic, and it actually sets you up for your wounds to be triggered a little bit more because you are not recognizing, I'm not blaming, but you're not recognizing that he actually doesn't have the capacity to do that yet. And so if I'm holding you to a standard where you don't have the capacity to do that yet, everyone's going to be disappointed. He's going to feel like a failure, and you're going to feel rejected and abandoned and neglected. And so, again, that goes to let me talk a little bit more about that piece as we're going into that. That goes to the ownership piece of this. What part is mine? Am I engaging in behaviors that are bumping up against my partner's wounds? Let me own that. Let me own that and acknowledge, hey, you know what, I when I said that I can see that really bumped up against your rejection wound, and that wasn't my intent. I do care about you. Let me own how my behaviors may be bumping up against yours. And the other part of ownership is identifying what needs I have. What are my needs? I need to be heard. I need to be validated. I need a hug. I need comfort. Those are needs that I have. And then I have to ask myself, well, is this person in the capacity where he can actually meet those needs? I can ask, and that's what I would recommend is, hey, I need a hug. I need validation that you heard me. I need to know that you can recognize that I'm in a lot of pain. I need that. Then the other person can own, hey, I'm not in the space where I can do that right now, or yeah, let me do that. They can own their part of that. This is when the more we practice this, the easier it becomes. um, but being able to own that, and if they say, hey, I'm not in a place to do that, well, I still have the need. I still need validation. I still need love. I still need a hug. So then I have to figure out where can I go to get that need met in a healthy way. Who else can I turn to? Because right now they're telling me they're not in a place to do that, but I still have the need. So where can I go? um, we could go on and on about that, but in a
Well, yeah,
nutshell.
yeah, and I was thinking too, because on a webinar with John Taylor, we talked about, like I think even saying, this is what I'm looking for from you, and I understand that you're not there yet. This is what the vision I have for us, and then in a healthy way, I'm going to take care of myself. But this is what I'm hoping that we can be working toward. And I think that gives some space for, here's the plan and here's the vision, and I'm gonna help hold the framework for this, because I have this view that this is where we can get to. I see the race, and I see the whatever, I see the markers, and I'm going to hold that space. But in the meantime, I'm going to do what I need to do, and I want you to be, doing what you need to do, so that you've got the strength to be able to go, okay, I am in this space. But it is baby steps. Early recovery, is so hard. We're asking people to stop that numbing out escape behavior. I mean, Troy and I have been in recovery for a few 24 hours, and we both have shared vulnerable moments where, like, fortunately we have enough tools to be able to go, I don't think that that's exactly right, I'm going to go check it out, and do that. But gosh, early on, it is very challenging, and it's going to be, tripping over stones a lot, so take care of yourself, you know keep putting your needs out there. I mean, yeah, I think if you can do it so it doesn't feel so unsafe, just say, this is what I'm looking for, what part of this can you, one on a spectrum, where can you step in? And, I think, but honestly, thank goodness you're on the recovery path. That, I mean, that you got a chance when you're on the recovery path.
Yeah.
So 2 more comments. One, I used the worksheet on the site Finding Peace last week spontaneously, and it really helped to dig in deeper. So that's great. And I hopefully let's put in the chat, where they can find that worksheet too. And then this comment is, I understand what you're saying. It seems like self-fulfilling behavior. I'm bad, I'm going to treat you bad, so you'll treat me bad. And now you're rejecting me instead of and so now you're rejecting me instead of me rejecting you. Or
Right, that you're describing the cycle. That is the cycle that you're describing. That is the cycle that you and your partner are continuing to be in. And part of getting out is recognizing, so as somebody who abuses other people, I'm not justifying their abuse. Their abuse is wrong. It's not okay. But abuser is usually abusing because they have so many of their own untreated wounds that they are now taking out their abuse, their own wounds. That's what my definition of abuse is I am taking my woundedness out on someone else. I'm inflicting harm onto somebody else. The underlying reason for that is because they have got their own wounds that are so deep that they have now gotten to a place where they end up inflicting that on someone else. And in an abuse situation, the victim needs to do what they need to do to get out of that abusive situation and begin to recover. The abuser has a lot of work to do too. But that cycle that is what you've been describing is that he's feeling rejected and you're feeling rejected, and then he gets all defensive and he goes into the burpees as a way of dealing with that which then activates your wounds, and around the cycle you go. So we look at, okay, who's going to stop the process? Somebody in this cycle stop the process. And since you're the one that's on the call, I would say, is it going to be you, or are you going to keep looking at your husband and saying, when are you going to stop the process? Because somebody's got to stop it. What I've found that happened, and The Anatomy of Peace does a really great job. It's a book by The Anatomy of Peace. I can't. The Harbinger Institute. They talk about the cycle, and they identify is that if I start seeing you differently, if I can start to see you from your pain and your suffering instead of what you've done to me, if I can start to have compassion for that, and I begin to develop empathy and hold space for that, I've now changed the dynamics of the relationship. I've shifted it, and now he has a different person to respond to. And so me changing my steps in this behavior, me identifying, when I go back to the screen, of me identifying that, yeah, I have a rejection wound, but I know that I matter and that I'm worthy of love and belonging. And uh, it's okay for me to share my needs, and I can recognize that you are also hurting, but you're worthy of love and belonging too. When I'm in that headspace, I'm responding differently. And now all of a sudden they sense that. They pick up on that. They're like, "Oh, you're not rejecting me? No, I'm here with you." And then they calm down a little bit. They're like, "Oh, I'm not going to be so defensive." And then you respond to that, and then they respond. It takes some practice, and it takes some work with couples, but that's the kind of the idea that I'm trying to share with you, is that if we can take ownership and shift the way we are responding, it will have an effect on the other part of this loop. If they're just in a place where they're not going to get better, then we have some decisions that we need to make. But I've seen just subtle changes in the way that I'm responding, in the way that I'm holding space for you, dramatically changes the spiral, and we're able to get out and into a much more loving and compassionate place.
Well, and I think if I have empathy for you, I'm not all focused on me, you know, and my rejection wounds. I mean, I was thinking, it shifts, it shifts it for me. You know, if I'm a long time ago, somebody in one of my 12-step meetings said, I'm a real small package if I'm all wrapped up in myself. And I had to think about that for a long time. But I finally, you know, what I've learned from that was that, you know, if I'm really focused, you know, on what everybody's doing to me, you know, that's a very different place than if I'm looking at you and you know, what you're, oh, you know, you've struggled with rejection, and gosh, you know, being curious, tell me more about that. Tell me about, you know, that pain that you experienced, because this feels like, you know, like when we talk about, you know, you've tripped up against my, you know, against my rejection. Well, okay, my rejection wound. Okay, well, tell me more about that. You know, where is, you know, where does that come? You know, I mean, like if I'm just curious about it and I want to learn, that's a very different thing than you've rejected me. You know, that's it's different language, and it takes
Mm-hmm.
the blame shifting out of it.
Yeah,
Oh, thanks for sharing that. So.
you're welcome. Yeah, I just put the link for the worksheet that the person had mentioned. Um, I think in previous recordings, I've gone through how you use the worksheet. I think I did that last month. So if you want to go back and watch that, you can watch how to do that.
So somebody
The
says, what are the 4 steps to get out presentation?
So there's the 2 steps, empathy and ownership. And yes, we can like break those down into a more like how do you do empathy, but it's really 2 steps. Empathy is my ability to see that you are, oh, I think I
Oh,
only did it.
I got it. You keep
Okay, thank
talking.
you. Empathy is my ability to see that you are suffering too. Empathy is me putting myself in your shoes and getting a sense of what that feels like for you. How I help people get there is I say, okay, they're telling you that they have a rejection wound. Can you think back in your life about a time when you felt rejected? Well, yeah, like I tried out for a team and I didn't make it. And so what did you feel? Well, I felt really disappointed, and I felt some anger, and I felt I had this thought like I'm never going to be enough, and I felt really defeated. Great. So now you're going to say to that other person, so do you feel really disappointed? Do you feel defeated? Do you feel like you're just not enough? I'm going to take that emotion that I felt with my rejection experience, and I'm just going to ask them, hey, is this what it feels like for you? If you get it right, they're going to say, yeah, that's totally what it feels like for me. If you get it wrong, they're saying, no, it's not like that. It's like this. And they're usually going to fill it in. They're going to say, well, it feels a little bit like this. And then you can reiterate that. So it sounds like it feels like you were just really um, shattered into a million pieces, and like you weren't sure that you're going to get your life back together. Is that what I'm hearing you say? Well, yeah, that's what I'm going to hear. As I'm hearing you describe that, I'm tapping into, well, that's got to really be painful for you. I'm so sad that you're feeling that way, and then I can express some feelings about that. I'm sad that you're feeling so hurt. That's what empathy looks like. And then the other person feels heard. They're like, well, thank you. Yes, it is really painful. Thank you. And the wonderful thing about empathy is that the moment the person feels heard, this is a tactic that we use in hostage negotiations. In hostage negotiations, empathy is the #1 tool that they use
Oh.
to try and help the person who has the hostages feel heard. Because every time they feel heard, their defenses go down a little bit, their walls go down a little bit, and they begin to then open up, and then we can have the dialogue about, okay, what do we need, and let's negotiate how to help get the hostages out. Empathy is a really, really effective tool. So if you're feeling like you're in a hostage situation with your spouse, empathy is the way to bring that down. And if you just keep being concerned about you and your feelings, we're not going to get anywhere. It's almost like you have to say, let me continue to practice empathy for a moment so that we can bring those defenses down. And then when they're down, then I can share what my experience was like. And because they don't feel so threatened, now they can practice empathy with you. So, and that's the first piece, is empathy. Just reiterating, is this what it feels like for you? That's got to be really painful. And the more that the person is saying, yes, that's what it is, that's like a thumbs up. Every time you get a yes from that, that's like, okay, I'm bringing it down. My emotions are coming down. And finally, you're like, wow, I'm so sad with you. What can I do to help? What can I do to support you? And then they can go. And then you can say, well, and here's what I need to feel supported. Is that something you can help hold space for me in? And that's the ownership piece. The ownership piece is also, well, yeah, I did do that. For example, the addict, yeah, I did look at porn, and I did lie to you about that. I'm owning that, and I can do that. I can own that if I'm not sucked into those shame plays. I can own that and say, yeah, I did that, and I can see that that was really hurtful for you, and that was not my intention, and the lies were really, really painful, and I can see that the devastation that. Sorry, I don't want to continue to do that. Here's what I do want for us in the future, and I can do that. I can have empathy for that um, as I'm owning it. So that's why it's kind of a two-step.
I was cracking up because I was like, okay, we've got burpees, and then now we've got a two-step. So I'm kind of thinking line dancing two-step. So I've got two images, burpees being tough,
Yeah.
but I actually like to dance. So I was like, okay, so the
Oh, good.
two-step is something I'd want to engage in. Burpees,
Yeah.
not so much. So it was
Right.
a good analogy.
Oh, I love that.
So
Yeah.
we're out of time. So thank you so much, Troy. So guys, are if you've got time tomorrow morning, Troy will be online tomorrow morning. And please check out the rest of the schedule on sexandrelationshiphealing.com. There's the podcast series, and Dr. Sue Johnson did do a podcast with Dr. Rob as well. So there's lots of content in there. So, so please keep coming back to the site. We've got lots more content, and we're developing more. So thanks, Troy, and see you next month.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.